Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, κυρία Μαροκιάν. Και τώρα ήρθε η ώρα να περάσουμε στην αναρκτήρια συνεδρία της διημερίδας μας και να καλέσουμε στο βήμα μια εκλεκτή προσκεκλημένη μας, την καθηγήτρια Τέσσα Hofman. Η κυρία Hofman έχει μια ιδιαίτερη συμβολή στο πεδίο των ζητημάτων για τα οποία απασχολούν τη διημερίδα μας. Οι δικές της σπουδές στις σλαβικές και στην κοινωνιολογία, είναι μέλος της εταιρείας Απειλούμενων Λαών και πρόεδρος μιας πολύ ιδιαίτερης ομάδας, εκείνης με τίτλο Speaking with One Voice, να μιλήσουμε με την ίδια γλώσσα, με την ίδια φωνή, που μας προτρέπει να υιοθετήσουμε συμπεριληπτική, ενιαία φωνή για την αναγνώριση της γενοκτονίας των Αρμενίων, των Αραμαίων και των Ελλήνων. Είναι διεθνώς γνωστή υπερασπίστρια των ανθρώπινων δικαιωμάτων, συγγραφέας περισσότερων από 12 βιβλίων για την ιστορία και τον πολιτισμό της Αρμενίας και επίσης εκείνη η οποία επιμελήθηκε τον πρώτο συλλογικό τόμο σε διεθνή, όπως μπορούμε να ονομάζουμε σήμερα τα αγγλικά, στην αγγλική γλώσσα, τον τόμο λοιπόν για τη γενοκτονία κατά των χριστιανών την τελευταία δεκαετία της Οθωμανικής κυριαρχίας. Είναι εξαιρετική τιμή που είναι μαζί μας και έχει το λόγο. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, most Reverend Metropolitan Antimo, most Reverend Archiepiscopos Chacherian, Kyrie Stepanidi, Paron Marouchian, and distinguished colleagues. September of this year brings the 100th anniversary of the seizure and torching of the Christian quarters in the Ionian capital of Smyrna. This event marks the end of a decade of persecution and genocidal crimes under two late Ottoman regimes, that of the Young Turks and Turkish Ittihad ve Terakki Cemiyeti, and that of the nationalist opposing government under Mustafa Kemal. During this decade, over 3 million indigenous Christians lost their lives in the Ottoman Empire, as well as in Ottoman-occupied northwestern Iran, as victims of massacres, deportations, and forced labor. 1.5 million of these were Armenians, over 1 million Greek Orthodox Christians, and at least 500,000 Syriacs. The decade in question of the state crimes committed before, during, and after the First World War covers the period from 1912 to 1922, which brought the Ottoman Empire not only the entry into a world war, but also the two Balkan Wars. The Balkan Wars, as well as the battles against the Allies and the Hellenic forces, which were perceived as wars of liberation from the Turkish point of view. At the same time, this decade was a time of great suffering for all parts of the Ottoman population as a result of the frequent warfare, mass flight, and massive deportations, and the pandemics they caused. It was a time of general famine, further aggravated by targeted measures of the Young Turk war regime in Mesopotamia, thus affecting not only the Armenians deported to this region, but also local Arab populations. In this introductory lecture, I will give an overview of the extermination of the Greek Orthodox Christians and try to justify why we call these crimes genocide, according to the United Nations Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute. I will also try to explain what were the specifics of the state's actions against the Greeks. Please let me start with an explanation. When we speak of Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, we do not mean an ethnic group or a linguistic community, but the Rum Milleti, the Ottoman church nation of Greek Orthodox Christians. This included not only ethnic Greeks, but also Albanians and Armenians who belonged to the Byzantine Orthodox faith. Some of these Greek Orthodox Armenians who came mainly from the Aegean region were also Greek-speaking. A further explanation is necessary. In the contemporary documentation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate or US Greek relief organizations cited here, the term Christians is not used generically, but is limited to Greek Orthodox Christians. Two relevant preparatory steps in the development towards genocide are social political exclusion and dehumanization. Exclusion was articulated already in August 1910 and September 1911 at the occasion of the third and fourth annual COP meeting at Selanik, Thessaloniki today. Mehmet Zia exempted the non-Muslims from the ethnic definition of a Turkish nation, quotation. Greeks, Armenians, and Jews who lived in Turkey were Turks only in respect of citizenship, but not of nationality. They would remain a foreign body in the national Turkish state, end quote. Zia was a member of the COP Central Committee since 1910 and leading ideologist of Turkism, who became the Deputy Home Minister Home Minister Mehmet Talat and was responsible for minority issues in the COP Central Committee. As an example of dehumanizing rhetoric by young Turkish officials and decision makers that has been increasingly used since the Balkan Wars, the words of Kuşçubaşı Eşref can be cited, a prominent agent and key member of the secret special organization, in Turkish Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, that was responsible for destroying the non-Muslim population. Already in summer 1914, he saw the non-Muslims of all denominations as internal tumors in the body of the Ottoman state, which had to be cleaned out. To do so, he claimed, was a national cause. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and especially 1913 led to the flight and expulsion of approximately 900,000 Muslims from the Balkans, of whom 632,000 died as a result of massacres, escape hardships, or epidemics. These events worsened the situation of Ottoman Christians. Leading politicians such as Ottoman War Minister Enver articulated revenge and retaliation against Christians, not only privately but also publicly. In this tense situation, the slogan of Islamization or Ottomanization of the Ottoman economy was coined. What was meant was Turkization. Until then, trade and commerce had been in the hands of non-Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, for reasons of religious prohibition of interest. Similar to the way interest transactions were left to Jews in Christian Europe, the Ottoman elites left taboo areas of income to non-Muslims for centuries. Now, however, propaganda-orchestrated boycott measures took place that were intended to ruin Christian producers and traders. The measures also affected Greek peasants in the Ottoman Empire, who were no longer allowed to bring in their crops or sell them on the market. This included a ban on collecting mulberry leaves for the silkworms that provided the livelihood for many Greeks engaged in textile production, as well as Armenians. The crackdown at the time in many ways anticipated the Nazi boycotts of the 1930s against Jews, including, for example, the intimidation of customers from the majority population who bought from Greeks. The Ottoman equivalent of the Nazi prohibition, "Don't buy from Jews," sounded, "Don't buy from Christians." The pamphlet published by the CUP, "A Path of Liberation for Muslims," said, quotation, "Oh my God, how we will celebrate the day when Turks and Muslims buy only from each other and consume only goods produced in Turkey, if possible. The most important task is to buy Turkish products as much as possible," end quote. The CUP publicist Munis Tekinalp rejoiced in his writing Turkism and Pan-Turkism of 1915 that the boycott had, quotation, "ruined hundreds of Greek and Armenian businessmen," end quote. The cruel irony was that this Dönme son of an Orthodox rabbi born in northern Greece, later in the era of the Turkish Republic, fell victim to the infamous wealth tax, in Turkish varlık vergisi, of 1942 to 1944. Because of his inability to pay the tax, he was sent to a concentration camp where he may well have met Greek and Armenian fellow sufferers. Quotation, "For the Jewish and Christian Turkish citizens, the tax became nothing less than a small-scale, bloodless financial massacre," end quote. The contemporary Greek accounts on which this overview is based describe the following measures taken by the Young Turk and Kemalist regimes against the Greek Orthodox population before, during, and after the World War. That is, economic boycotts, as mentioned, confiscation of movable and immovable property without compensation, mass arrests of notables followed by the torture, execution, or murder, forced resettlement or deportation or expulsion under intentionally severe to lethal conditions, forced labor, forced assimilation or forced Islamization, including forced settlement in Muslim majority or Turkish localities, killings at the place of residence during deportation or at the place of deportation, forced child transfer, and finally, targeted destruction of churches, monasteries, and places of residence. A particular feature of the Ottoman genocide against Christians was the targeted extermination or eliticide of the intellectual and spiritual elite, especially Greeks and Armenians. Beginning in early March 1915, leading Ottoman Greeks were deported from various regions of the empire: Eastern Thrace, Pontus, Constantinople, as part of the eliticide. The Hellenic legation to Constantinople reported, quotation, "Up to the 8th of the current month of March, over 200 leading men of Constantinople had been expelled to Bilecik, Yenişehir, and other parts of the interior of Asia Minor," end quote. In its communication 1246 of the 2nd of March, the Hellenic legation mentioned as many as 10,000 Greeks deported from the Ottoman capital city to Asia Minor. Throughout June and July 1915, the arrests of Greek Orthodox Christians continued. In the Sanjaks and Kazakhs of Büyükdere, Çorlu in Greek Tiroloi, Çatalca in Greek Metre, and Silivri, 60 more Greeks were arrested, imprisoned in Constantinople, and deported after a few months. Unlike the eliticide against the Ottoman Armenians, the eliticide against the Ottoman Greeks occurred repeatedly under the COP regime as well as under the Kemalists. In 1921, Mustafa Kemal established special tribunals called Courts of Independence, which issued arbitrary death sentences against Greek Orthodox Ottomans. In all areas under control of the nationalist government, hundreds of Greeks were executed by hanging or massacred. In particular, during the initial phase, among them many publishers, entrepreneurs, the mayors of cities, towns and villages, and members of the Ottoman parliament. Thus, the intellectual and political elite of the Asian Minor Greeks was destroyed in the course of a few months. According to the Greek scholar Konstantinos Photiadis, the emphasis was on the Pontus. Photiadis writes, quotation, "The list of Pontian Greeks sentenced to death was much more extensive than similar lists from other areas. Most of them were hanged on the same day and time, September the 8th of 1921 in the Amasya Square. 72 Greek martyrs were led there and were mercilessly sacrificed. Most outstanding among them was Archimandrit Plato, a brave and inspired old man who chose to preach the holy word to his brothers for the last time and then moved on courageously to his end. The victims were sent to the gallows in groups of 10. The atrocious process went on until 10 in the morning." End quote. In the Pontus region alone, the daily rate of hanging was 60 during September 1921. In his telegram to the League of Nations, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople quoted the Turkish newspapers of Samsun, the Ehale and the Hilal of the 18th, 19th and 25th of September 1921, giving a list of 3 Armenians and 186 Greeks, including 2 naturalized Americans, 1 missionary, and the other professor at the American College at Merzivan. In the vicinity of Kavak in Pontus, 1,300 Greeks were shot on the 15th or 16th August 1921 in about 2.5 hours. During the meeting of the Armenian Greek section of the 31st August 1921 at the British representation of Constantinople, Dr. Theotokos read the Ecumenical Patriarchate's report of the 24th of August 1921, which covered the, quotation, question of Ottoman Greeks who were being tried by the Turkish courts for supposed acts of brigandage, and said that the prisoners were being ill-treated and subjected to severe humiliation, and that through fear of worse treatment, they made no complaint to Captain Wilson when he interrogated them on the round of inspection, end quote. In the meeting of the 12th of October 1921, quotation, Dr. Theotokos said that a Greek lady who had escaped from Samsun had furnished the Patriarchate with a reliable and vivid account of the recent executions in that town. The victims were given 3 days' notice of their fate. They were hanged naked and in batches, all the condemned having to undergo the terrible ordeal of standing by and witnessing the executions until their turn arrived. In one case, a father and son were given the option of choosing which should be hanged first, end quote. The Kemalist eliticide affected also Greeks living in central Anatolia. For example, in late 1919 or 1920, Greek Orthodox notables and elders of Ankara were taken to a nearby location and massacred. After the First World War, under the Kemalist regime, the persecution of Greeks continued in the Black Sea province of Kastamoni. Quotation. On May 13, 1921, the newspaper Eleftherios Typos revealed that, quotation, the prisons of Bafra are full of Greek ethnics unjustifiably incarcerated. Many Greek priests and notables from the surrounding villages were arrested, led to Samsun, and committed to the local prison. They were over 500, end quote. Partly in parallel, in the late Ottoman Empire, Turkification and assimilation were to be achieved by geographical dispersion, mainly by resettlement and deportations. Partly in parallel, but mainly following the elimination of the political, economic, and spiritual Christian elites, the deportation of the rest of the population was carried out. According to a 1918 report by the Hellenic Foreign Ministry, a roughly estimated 200,000 Greek Orthodox Christians were deported within the Ottoman Empire during the World War. Of these, 30,000 were evacuated in February 1918 alone from the Sanjak Samsun, and 22,336 until January 1917 from the Casa of Giresun. These organized forced relocations are not to be confused with forced evictions or expulsions, usually of entire villages that had been terrorized, plundered, and burned down. Their inhabitants could only escape to the mountains and forests, where many of them died of exhaustion, hunger, or diseases. In the case of relocations, however, the deportees were dispelled among Muslim settlements if they had survived the relocation at all. On the 17th of October 1917, Frank Jackson, chairman of the U.S. Relief Committee for Greeks of Asia Minor, announced in New York that, quotation, more than 700,000 Greeks have fallen victim to persecution in the form of death, suffering, or deportation. The story of the Greek deportations is not yet generally known. Quietly and gradually, the same treatment is being meted out to the Greeks as to the Armenians and Syrians. There were some 2 or 3 million Greeks in Asia Minor at the outbreak of the war in 1914, subject to Turkish rule. According to the latest reliable and authoritative accounts, some 700,000 to 800,000 have been deported, mainly from the coast regions into the interior of Asia Minor. Along with the Armenians, most of the Greeks of the Marmara regions and Thrace have been deported on the pretext that they gave information to the enemy. Along the Aegean coast, Ayvalık stands out as the worst sufferer. According to one report, some 70,000 Greeks have been deported towards Konya and beyond. At least 7,000 have been slaughtered. The Greek bishop of Ayvalık committed suicide in despair, end quote. The central and eastern Anatolian provinces of vilayets of Konya, Ankara in Greek Angora, Sivas, Kastamonu, Mamouret-ül-Aziz, or today Elazığ, were destinations for Armenian and Greek deportees from Western Anatolia and Pontus during and after the World War, as well as regions whose Greek and Armenian populations were deported themselves. In the Greek case, the deportations took place again under the Kemalist regime, but apparently less systematically than in the Armenian case of 1915. Already in July and August 1914, months before the Ottoman entry into the World War, Greek Orthodox men in the age groups of 18 to 48 years had been drafted into the notorious Amele Tabulari, or labor battalions, of the Ottoman army. Many of them did not survive the hardships of compulsory labor, malnutrition, and poor accommodation, or the lack of it altogether. In his report of the 7th of March 1917, the Hellenic consul of Konya, in Greek Ikonion, described the situation at a time when Greece was still neutral, quotation. These unfortunate men, on being drafted into these battalions, are distributed throughout the interior of the empire, from the coast of Asia Minor to the Black Sea, to Baghdad, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, some to construct military roads, others to make tunnels for the Baghdad Railroad, and others to cultivate the fields. Receiving absolutely no pay, badly nourished and clothed, exposed to changes in the weather, to the blazing sun of Baghdad and the intolerable cold of the Caucasus, assailed by sickness, fever, eruptive typhoid, and cholera, they are perishing by thousands. For a while, those able to pay the exemption fees were released from service. And thus, those who were relatively well off were rescued from ruin and sure death. But for the last 5 months, these too have been compelled to serve in these labor battalions. While visiting the hospitals of the city of Iconium, I have seen these unfortunates stretched out on their beds or on the ground like living skeletons, waiting in agony for death as their deliverer from this life of misery and privation. There is a total lack of drugs and food, and the only attention any sick receive is a visit from the doctor twice a day. Those who are able to stand go about the streets of the city begging a piece of bread. In order to give a faithful picture of this grievous situation, it is enough to state that the cemetery of Iconium, as a result of the great mortality of the Greeks working in these battalions, has been filled to overflowing with graves in which not one corpse, as it is the usual custom, is buried, but into which are cast like dogs as many as 4, 5, or even 6 dead. As for the deserters, they were not only treated with the harshest cruelty, but their alleged existence in a given village was often the excuse for tortures of the other inhabitants to make them disclose their whereabouts, accompanied by confiscation, plundering, massacre, and other excesses, end quote. In a German cable of the 12th of May 1918 to the Foreign Office in Berlin, the statements of Ottoman prisoners of war were quoted, who spoke of a quotation, methodical annihilation of the Greeks, end quote, due to the general mobilization, the confiscation of their property, and the deportations. These captives mentioned a number of more than 200,000 Greek draftees until the end of 1917, of which many had been slaughtered or committed suicide in order to escape the hardships. Under such fatal conditions, the mortality rate of the Greek slave laborers from Western Anatolia was extremely high. The British diplomat George William Rendell estimated, quotation, that a Greek's life expectancy in the work battalions was less than 2 months due to the hard work required and inadequate nourishment, end quote. After the World War, the issue of the Ottoman Christian labor conscripts was raised during a parliamentary debate by Emanuel Emanuelidis, who was a member of the CUP and a native of Pontus. Even at that time, Emanuelidis estimated the number of victims among the forced laborers as high as 250,000. The use of Greek Orthodox men of conscript age continued under the Kemalists. Already on the 2nd of March 1921, the National Assembly at Ankara ordered the reintroduction of labor battalions for Ottoman non-Muslims. According to Leyla Nezi of the Sabancı University, quotation, one of the main reasons for the formation of these units was to ensure that local non-Muslims, particularly local Greeks, would leave their regions of origin and not join the forces fighting the Turks, end quote. The Ayvalık-born writer Elias Venezis, from his own experience, called the Greek forced laborers slaves and reported on the 4 convoys of forced laborers assembled from Ayvalık in October 1922 that out of the roughly 3,000 male labor conscripts, only 23 survived, less than 1%. In his memoirs, Venezis tells how the Ayvalık conscripts were kept in the local prison several nights, during which 15 were selected to march outside the town to be bayoneted to death, while the remaining 43 were marched to the various labor camps of Western Anatolia. His group was the 4th such recruited group from Ayvalık. But in difference to the first 3 groups numbering in hundreds, his was determined to die in a slower way. At the end of the second, that is the Kemalist draft of Greek labor conscripts, and during the final stage of genocide, a Greek physician noticed a death toll of 80% in Islahiye, that is in the Sanjak of Jebel Bereket in the province of Adana. Quotation. During my stay in Islahiye, I saw labor battalions conscripted exclusively of 5,000 Greeks from Denizli. They were decimated in a very few months. Starvation, forced labor of a daily work schedule of 12 hours, uninterrupted hard labor, sunstroke, illness, and deprivation of all necessities brought conditions in which barely 1,000 managed to survive. They would enter the hospital daily 100 sick persons, the majority of whom would die the following day, end quote. In his telegram of the 25th of April 1922, the British High Commissioner at Constantinople, Horace Rumbold, mentioned that quotation, "The whole Greek population from the age of 15 upwards of the Trebizond area and the hinterland has been deported, apparently to labor battalions at Erzurum and other places," end quote. Expulsions or forced displacements are considered crimes against humanity under Article 7D of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Deportation tends to degenerate into death marches and often constitute a genocidal method, especially when carried out under conditions of war, famine, and epidemics. In the Ottoman case, the intention to exterminate is also clearly demonstrated by the circumstances that accompanied the deportations. That is, inhuman treatment by their guards and extreme weather conditions. In the case of the Pontus Greeks, midwinter. In the case of the Armenians, summer heat. They were deliberately chosen to reduce the number of deportees as rapidly as possible. Most of the Greek and Armenian deportees had to be on foot. In the case of the Greeks, the distances between their place of residence and their place of exile varied greatly. Sometimes, especially in the provinces of Adrianople and Constantinople, Christians were deported or expelled within their province or to neighboring provinces. But as a rule, however, they had to travel great distances of hundreds of kilometers. Unlike the Armenians, whose main deportation area was southward into Mesopotamia, into Syria and Iraq, most Greeks were deported from western Anatolia or the Pontus region eastwards to central and eastern Anatolia. When Greeks or Armenians were deported by rail, by the Anatolian and Baghdad railways, it was done, as in the Second World War, by the Nazi regime in cattle wagons. In the Ottoman case, it was in wagons for sheep and goats. Adult deportees could only crouch or sit in these wagons, not stand upright. The organizers of the ruthless, violent resettlements willingly accepted that numerous Christian deportees died of exhaustion, hunger or thirst, of cold or heat, as well as of epidemics, especially typhus and cholera, and that the epidemics spread throughout the entire Ottoman Empire, especially since corpses were not buried as a rule, and were sometimes even disposed of in wells and cisterns, that is, in the drinking water systems. The Greek Orthodox Metropolitan of Ankara mentioned on 15 March 1917 that at that time 2/3 of the deportees had already perished in this province and in the neighboring province of Sivas. In this respect, the evaluation of the Young Turk and Kemalist deportations under international law is pursuant to Article 2C of the UN Genocide Convention. An important difference to the extermination of the Armenians was that the Armenian deportees, especially those from the provinces of Erzurum, Marmaret-Ulaziz, Trabzonspor, Konya, and Ankara, were mostly slaughtered on their way by specially recruited killing squads, in Turkish çeteler or irregulars. In the case of Greeks, such mass killings in the course of the deportation remained the exception. One example is provided by the report of the Ottoman officer Mehmet Rauf of the 22nd of November 1921. He observed mass killings of Greek deportees from Alajam and Bafra in the region of Çorum. But even if deportations of Greeks were not accompanied by massacres, they were no less fatal because they were deliberately designed that way, as can be seen from numerous contemporary accounts. How did contemporaries themselves assess the crimes committed against Ottoman Christians and Greeks in particular? Remarkably, the documentation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate published in 1919 under the title Persecution of the Greeks in Turkey contains the terms destruction 31 times, for example, destruction of that diocese, plan of destruction, destruction of the Christians, and 15 times the term annihilation, for example, complete annihilation, systematic annihilation of the Christians in Turkey, and 16 times the term extermination, for example, extermination of the Greek element, methods of extermination. Destruction, annihilation, and extermination are all synonyms of genocide. The Greek authors of these documentations were as convinced of the genocidal intent of both the Ottoman government and the Muslim population as were contemporary foreign diplomats. Quite early, the German embassy noted genocidal intent among their Ottoman allies. In early June 1915, the COP Triumvir and Minister of the Interior Mehmet Talat informed the German embassy at Pera in Constantinople about his government's intention, quotation, to use the opportunity of the World War for profoundly decimating their internal enemies, the indigenous Christians of all denominations, without being disturbed by diplomatic interventions from abroad, end quote. In view of the massacres and deportations in the west of Pontus, the head of the German government, Imperial Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, concluded on the 31st of January 1917, quotation, "The indications are that the Turks plan to eliminate the Greek element as enemies of the state, as they did earlier with the Armenians. The strategy implemented by the Turks is of displacing people to the interior without taking measures for their survival by exposing them to death, hunger, and illness. The abandoned homes are then looted and burned or destroyed. Whatever has done to the Armenians is being repeated with the Greeks," end quote. Former US Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, in his memoirs written in 1918, referred to the Ottoman Greeks as the first victims of the COP's nationalizing idea and emphasized that the Greeks suffered the same fate as the Armenians, with the difference that their deportations were bona fide deportations because they occurred without massacres. He explained this difference by the fact that, quotation, "the Greeks, unlike the Armenians, had a government which was virtually interested in their welfare. At this time, there was a general apprehension among the Teutonic allies that Greece would enter the war on the side of the Entente, and a wholesale massacre of Greeks in Asia Minor would unquestionably have produced such a state of mind in Greece that its pro-German king would have been unable longer to keep his country out of the war. It was only a matter of state policy, therefore, that saved these Greek subjects of Turkey from all the horrors that befell the Armenians, end quote. When Morgenthau wrote these lines in 1918, he was referring to events before and during the World War, but not to the final and deadliest phase of the extermination of Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, the period of 1919 to 1922, when massacres and deportations of Greeks increasingly occurred nationwide under the rule of Mustafa Kemal's nationalist counter-government. Smyrna, the cosmopolitan little Paris of the Orient, was the last stage of what is called the Asia Minor tragedy in the official modern history of Greece. Defeated by the Turkish nationalist forces, deserted by the Allies, the retreat of the Hellenic forces from Asia Minor in late summer 1922 became a massive flight, joined by 10,000s of Ottoman Christian civilians. By the size of its population, Smyrna was the second largest city of the Ottoman Empire. It was at the same time a predominantly non-Muslim city, called Gavur, that is infidel Smyrna, for that reason by Muslims. According to the estimate by US Consul George Horton, the city's population exceeded 500,000, of whom 150,000 were Greeks and 25,000 Armenians and Jews each. Based on the official Ottoman statistical yearbook, the German consulate estimated that at the beginning of the 20th century, Smyrna's population was 300,000, with a relative Greek Orthodox majority of 140,000 and a minority of 90,000 Muslims. The population was fragmented. Each group lived on its own ethno-religious island with its own educational, cultural, and other institutions. The Hellenic forces and administration disembarked on the 8th of September 1922. In the early hours of the next morning, regular and irregular Kemalist cavalry under the command of Nureddin Pasha occupied the now completely undefended city and first looted and then destroyed the Armenian quarter Hainots in the north of Smyrna before setting it on fire in the night of the 13th September. The Armenian eyewitness and survivor Karapet Hacheryan noted in his diary, Wednesday the 13th, after traversing a few districts, I enter Chalgıcı Başı, where there is very little activity. I see a Turkish soldier on patrol. It is obviously that the Hainots and the surroundings are under siege. I continue my path towards Chalgıcı Başı, but on the passage leading from Katırcıoğlu to Chalgıcı Başı, I see a Turk who approaches me saying, "We did what was due. You turn back." The Turk, who obviously had assumed an active role in the arson, takes me obviously for his compatriot and accomplice and advises me not to advance, end quote. Lasting 4 days, the obviously manipulated fire of Smyrna destroyed the lower parts of the city, which were Christian or European. Many Christians died in their burning houses or were killed by collapsing walls. One of the prominent victims of the massacres was the martyred and posthumously canonized Greek Orthodox Metropolitan of Smyrni, Chrysostomos Kalafatis, who had become a hate figure for Turkish nationalists Since 1914, when he invited European diplomats from Constantinople to inspect the atrocities committed in Ionia. Although Chrysostomos had been offered a passage from Smyrna by the Catholic Archbishop of the city already on the 25th of August, he declined the safe escape with the words, quotation, "It is a tradition of the Greek Church and the obligation of a priest to stay with his parish," end quote. A few days before his death, on the 31st of August, Chrysostomos, as the Metropolitan of Smyrni, sent a letter to Meletios, the ecumenical patriarch at Constantinople, in which he blamed the Allied High Commissionership for the destruction of the Ottoman Greeks because of its order to disarm them, and in which he predicted the massacre of the undefended Christian population in Smyrna. Numerous Christians drowned in the harbor of Smyrna when trying to escape to the Allied navy of 27 battleships, among them 3 American destroyers. It added to the horrors of the people of Smyrna that the Allies watched more or less indifferently how their Christian co-religionists were burned, slaughtered, raped, shot down by machine guns, or drowned. On the 16th of September, Nureddin ordered a proclamation according to which all Greek and Armenian men of 18 until 45 years of age would be treated as prisoners of war, quotation, until the termination of his hostilities, end quote. All others, residents of Smyrna or refugees from outside, were ordered to leave the country until the end of September 1922. Men and women were then separated, the men led away and shot in groups. Dr. Esther Paul Lovejoy of the American Red Cross was eyewitness to the fate of the approximately 200,000 remaining Christian women. Consul Horton wrote about the fate of the Greek Orthodox men deported from Smyrna and its vicinities after September 1922. Quotation, "This last scene on the Smyrna quay reveals the whole diabolical and methodically carried out plan of the Turks. The soldiers were allowed to glut their lust for blood and plunder and rape by falling first on the Armenians, butchering and burning them and making free with their women and girls. But the Greeks, for whom a deeper hatred existed, were reserved for a slower and more leisurely death. The few that had been coming back tell terrible tales. Some were shot down or killed off in squads. All were starved, and thousands died of disease, fatigue, and exposure. Authentic reports of American relief workers tell of small bands far inland that started out thousands strong," end quote. The French historian and author René Puot estimated the number of Greeks deported into the interior of Anatolia after the seizure of Smyrna as high as 150,000. Most of these captives were massacred outside Smyrna or other Greek towns of western Anatolia. The remainder was kept in a state of slavery and treated with genocidal intent. For Raphael Lemkin, the main author of the United Nations Genocide Convention, genocide was not limited to the physical destruction of ethnic or religious groups, but comprised the destruction of their cultures and other elementary spheres of life. Lemkin had developed his complex definition of genocide, which went far beyond the physical destruction of national, ethnic, or religious collectives as early as 1944. Newspaper reports of the years 1946 and 1947 on the debate of international penalization of genocide indicate that Lemkin was well aware of the Greek co-victims in the destruction of Ottoman Armenians during the First World War, and after giving at lectures the quotation "Armenian and Greek massacres by Turkey" as examples of state crimes which could have been prevented with an appropriate law. I come now to the conclusions, to the question of lessons to be learned. Greeks, Armenians, but also foreign witnesses share the feeling of powerlessness and lament the lack of humanitarian intervention. In 1923, René Piot pointed out to the distinct European dimension in the responsibility for the Smyrna disaster, quotation, "Perhaps the immensity of the tragedy of Smyrna could have been avoided or at least diminished had there not existed a twofold illusion, the trust of the great powers in the Turks, and second, the trust of the Christians of Asia Minor in the great powers," end quote. Even 100 years after the so-called Asia Minor catastrophe, we are still confronted with helplessness, indifference, and impotence in the fate of mass state violence. Putin's war against Ukraine provided the latest, but unfortunately not the only example in post-World War II Europe. Genocidal murderers like to invoke the brief memory of world public opinion and only trust in strength as well as in brutality. Quotation. "As to what the weak Western European civilization asserts about me, that is of no account. I have given the command and I shall shoot everyone who utters one word of criticism. For the goal to be obtained in the war is not that of reaching certain lines, but physically demolishing the opponent." And so far, the present command relentlessly and without compassion to send into death many women and children of Polish origin and language. Only thus we gain the living space that we need. Who, after all, is today speaking about the destruction of the Armenians? Hitler asked this his generals on the 22nd of August 1939, shortly before the German invasion of Poland. By insisting on the memory of past state crimes, we hope to prevent future crimes. The trust of the perpetrator in our forgetfulness and indifference must be broken, and we must stop referring to crimes as disasters or catastrophes. Tsunamis are disasters. In the so-called Asia Minor catastrophe, everything was man-made. People disenfranchised, humiliated, tortured, and killed other people. And still other people looked on and let the crimes happen. Coming to terms with the past helps us understand the patterns from which the greatest of all conceivable human crimes, genocide, is made. And we hope to move through cognition to prevention. Thank you for your attention.
Πώς να ευχαριστήσουμε την κυρία Hofman για αυτή την τόσο σημαντική, τεκμηριωμένη αναφορά στην πλήρη εικόνα της διαδρομής της τόσο γεωγραφικής, ιστορικής, γεγονότων και καταστάσεων, οι οποίες μέχρι να φτάσουμε στη γενοκτονία που αποτελεί τη σημερινή μας συζήτηση. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Many thanks for this so well structured and the fully screen of so different but all joined events and conditions who driven us in this condition. Thank you. Θα σας ζητούσαμε, ωστόσο, αν υπάρχουν ερωτήσεις ή σχόλια προς την καθηγήτρια κυρία Hofman, να τις έχουμε, δεδομένου ότι θα αργήσουμε να φτάσουμε στην προγραμματισμένη συζήτηση. Έχουμε? Έχω ένα φως πάνω μου που δεν σας βλέπω όλους. Αν υπάρχει κάτι, έχουμε μικρόφωνο που θα μπορούσατε να ακουστεί το σχόλιο σας ή τυχόν ερώτημα. Thank you so much. Είναι πολύ δύσκολο να ευχαριστούμε για τόσο σημαντικές συμβολές στη σημερινή μας παρουσίαση.